if we look at what FIGAF is, then there's a lot of different questions and comments around what is it that we can do. One of the things that we try to convey is this thing about it is for both developers, for testers, architects, transporters, operation. So this is like one tool that covers the full end-to-end process. And then for the purpose of this transport discussion, obviously auditors is also a big part of this this discussion. Yes. Yes, Gregory, the session is going to be recorded. It's also even on YouTube right now, so you can also see it there, but we'll be posting it later. Yes, next slide.
I'm sorry, it's my keyboard is teasing a little bit. There we go.
Cool. And I guess this is one of the things we would talk a lot about when doing governance. So if you don't spend, if you just do file export import, the level of governance you have is quite small, but you may not be spending too much time on this. And then the more governance you want to have as part of your requirements for delivering integration, the more time you're going to spend on it. That's the general, and you can obviously define or decide whether or not how this curve goes up, if it's exponentially, because yeah, the more you need, the more it is going to take generally. And then we have this option of FIGAF that enables you to simplify how you run your SAP or how you manage this integration. And this is improving, as you probably will be seeing, and hopefully that's what, or hopefully this is what you'll see, will lower the time effort, but give you much more governance than you would have in any other way. That was one too fast. We just look at the transform. I just have a small poll just to have some insight about what is it, how you actually do your transports now, what is actually important. And I think this is what you would also see in a PI world. It would be the same kind of requirements that you have. Some business user create a JIRA or whatever way you're handling this request response scenario. Then you go in and say, yes, we have a developer building something around this. The developer then goes in and prepares the transport, figure out how do we actually, what is it that we want to transport? And as a part of this, there's a lot of documents that you need to create that all covers this relevance. So change request, technical documentation, list of our configurations, all in one, as that should be improved to do this. And obviously, yeah, a lot of you says here, so let's just close the result for the transport. A lot of you are doing, I don't know if you can actually see it, but a lot or 60% is doing file export import, some doing Cloud ALM and some doing CTS Plus. But yeah, then that is to create this, and obviously your file export import, the level of governance you have is probably not that high because it's really difficult. And then you have the approvers. Most likely if you're using Cloud ALM or Charm or some other things, you probably do have some guy that's approving. And then you ask basis to import, configure, and deploy this. If you're doing a file export, that is probably also the developer. So that means all of this is actually the developer, maybe even the business requirements is the developers. And that is somewhat what we need to understand, how we can improve, what can be made better. Yes?
Next.
Yes. And
is that the right one?
Too far. So the one less.
I don't know why this keeps skipping. But that's the traceback is number 8. Oh, sorry.
There was okay. This one. So I have also, let's just hide the result here. So sometimes when I've worked with some companies that said, yes, we have this Cloud ALM or transport process or charm, and we have this guy that is sitting and approving the transport. And my frustration is somewhat, okay, so you have some person that sits and approves that you have put the correct transport order number together with the correct document that you have filled in. But that's basically it. No validation whether or not this makes sense, no validation, stuff like that. It's like, then you're just doing transfer or approval just because you need approval, but not adding any value to that. And that's, as I see it, just a waste of time.
And maybe also adding that, was this tested or something? Like, is that any way documented when you approve something? It's so you just ask that question often open, right? And saying like, was it tested? Yeah, sure, right? But it's so yeah.
Yeah, this is especially true if you go into the file export, then you probably don't have either an approval also. And yeah, I think it makes sense. And then if we add the FIGAF tool, so we try to keep the process much of the same. The only thing is that we would still go in, we can automate a lot of all the different steps that is a part of this. This process, making sure that you do all the relevant thing. And then our approval step, I think that is the important part. This is where you actually go in and add specific value to this. And ideally, you get someone to actually review the interfaces you have, giving you some real feedback on, well, did you actually do this the correct way? Is this how we do lookups in our organization? Is the error handling correct? Stuff like that. And I think it is much more of more than approval to just understand what goes on there. And then the basis task, the import, configuration, and deploy, all would happen in an autonomous process. Yep. Comments on it or? Okay, and then one of the other part about, okay, so why do you document? That's also this thing about once you go into your system and something fails, which it likely will, no matter what, are you actually able to go back and say, hey, this was changed 2 days ago because the business opened this technical requirement to add this? Then it really does help you understanding where is it that we should be focusing on such requirements. And I think that's also some of the things that we would be showing in this today. Yep. So try to skip a little fast over all of this. And maybe a little more details about some of these approvals, that what is it that comes out. If you have comments, questions, just put them into the chat and we'll try to cover that also. But normally when you see an approval, or in this normal example, if you're using Cloud ALM, for instance, you can see that the iflow number is maybe the version also. You can add some comments about what this is about. Then in a separate document, you need to write for the basis, this is how to configure this. These are the properties. This is the manual steps that you would need to add. If you instead go to FIGAF, you have more options. You can obviously see all the iflow that's deployed or that's going to be deployed in this, plus all the other artifacts that's a part of it. You can validate all the dependencies. Do we actually have the function libraries included? You can see the change history. Dependencies, code, iflows. You can check the site guidelines. Really useful also when you're doing review and see, hey, have they actually considered all the exceptions that the design is giving? You can see all the configurations of iflows and parameters that's going to be applied in this. You can even do it in Excel if you have tens and or hundreds of iflows that you're going around with, and just do a sanity check. Are there any of these dev URLs that you're supposed to be using or not supposed to be using when going into production? You can also do custom checks, validations on this, and we also have Git validations that enable you to check, hey, we want to run a pipeline, want to do some special steps. That's also support. So there's a question about whether we can migrate the PI versions to Integration Suite. So we do have an option to do migration of PI objects. There's a lot of content around that. That is really, yeah, one of the good places also to start with the tool, getting it for a migration project where you're moving all this code, testing. And once you have done that, you need to use this transport process, because that is what will give you most benefits in this run. Next. Obviously, you'll add questions or comments onto this. So when we look at about this, what is actually the business case for getting a better way of managing your integration? So how much time are you spending on this governance structure? So it may be that the validation takes 2 minutes to do, but if you need to wait or create a service ticket, get someone to do it, and then you're delaying the transport process quite a bit. There's also a comment about, okay, so how do we actually ensure that the problems that we're having, or when you're debugging something in your productive system, does it actually work? And is that because you forgot to change the dev URL to a production URL? All of these things is something you can simplify by having a better understanding of the transport and governance around it. I would say one of the key, or my first projects, was to do a lot of documentations around this, and I don't like doing documentation. Maybe that is the reason why the FIGAF company is building all of this technology around transport management automations. So it is making sure we're spending the time on the right things. And then yeah.
Just that, because also I think this is also a question of quality, right? Because it's like when somebody pushes that button and say, let's go in production, how much quality is there in that decision? Is it again just randomly somebody was like, okay, let's do it? Or what's the analysis before that decision is made? What's the quality of that analysis? And often we find, like, do you just trust the developer? And we've worked also a long time as developers, so of course we like that idea. But again, in the end, there has to be maybe more than just trusting your developers. You have to say, like, how can I ensure some kind of quality, that I ensure that it doesn't matter if you have 100 different developers, they all get sort of the same checks of saying, like, okay, this is good enough, let's move to production. And that quality, how can you make that generic or more global, depending on regardless of how big an organization you're working in? So that's also one of the, I think, the important points here. It's not just about wasting time, it's also putting in quality, right?
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the things that you have been working on when we worked at different customers, like, hey, please do follow, this is the process, this is how we build integration here, instead of just the cowboy method. Hey, I can do a lookup, I can do these things, I can move it in, I can just make the change in production, because I don't have the time for the other things.
Next.
So when we're looking at a FIGAF transport, we'll get into this in the demo, just show you what this is. But the basis is that we have a number of different components. We have, I guess it starts out with the business data, a link to a Jira, description. What is it that we are going to do with this? Then we have packages, iflow package, all the integration suite content. We have iflow packages, script collections, and all the other dependent artifacts. we have partner directory, and we also have security artifacts. You can put all of this into a transport and then import it. And the same thing is also with B2B stuff. And here we have both meet, max, partner, self, and then agreement, including the templates. And this is all the content that you would need to do migrations or imports. There's still some gaps, something we could more add to it, but this is a pretty comprehensive guide. And I think once we get into the B2B stuff, there is a hugely important what we have seen. I think this is your.
Yes, and I think that this will become clear also when we look at the demo I'm going to do in a while. But one important thing is that if you look at especially dependent objects, so now the standard solution, I guess first just to briefly go through, if you're talking about B2B properly done in the integration suite, you're going to have to talk also about TPM. Simply, it will not work without TPM. And SAP is becoming a lot more strict about how to use TPM. Now it's like you actually have to use it correctly or it will not work. So when you talk B2B, you talk TPM. And when you talk TPM, you actually have to do it correctly this time. And I say this time because, let's be honest, in PO, you could pretty much do what you wanted with the TPM. You could say, well, we use it, we don't use it, we use it a little bit and stuff like that. It was a kind of a very fluent application. That's not the case anymore. You do it right. And that means that suddenly you're like, okay, then it's suddenly more important that you make sure your design is in place. And I'm going to show you that when you just, for example, build your own custom mappings or whatever, very quickly you will have maybe 20, 30, 50 objects every time you move one agreement. And again, what's the alternative here is that you go into SAP and then you sit and pick those manually.
Operate them directly in the target system 2 times.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's all like, what is the plan here? How are you going to manage it when suddenly we're talking about every time you create one agreement, you might need 50 objects there. And then even worse, you're not going to need 50 unique objects. They are all going to overlap and be reused across agreements. And this is why suddenly it's very important that you know precisely what am I moving and what's going to be impacted. Did somebody test this? And then, okay, I guess we are safe. Let's go. How can you make that analysis and do it feeling comfortable about it and confident about it? So that's what I'm going to show also about how you can suddenly now get a much more improved framework for then managing this.
Yep.
Oops, let me move on.
We have 2 ways of doing transports. Well, that we are currently supporting and working on. One is the sequence method, or sequence version. This is where our idea was when we build some changes. For instance, we have a project. We would create a number of different transport to go to. The first part of the initial release of the project we will create a transport, move it into QA. And then we will find that there is some bugs on this, and we will do a patch of all the different iflows and artifacts that needs to go into QA. And then once we have tested the QA, we will create a new transport from QA to production. And this will then streamline and say, okay, it is only these artifacts that we want to move. You'll only move the latest version into production. And yeah, you're making it much less dependent on the different artifacts that otherwise included in this. The other one, and this is the new one, we call it locked version. It mimics the classic CTMS style transport where you create a transport and it's then going to be scheduled on all the different systems that you this transport needs to go into. Here, once you create a transport, it'll create 2 artifacts, one for QA and one for production. And then you can obviously only import the QA the production after the QA has been imported.
Yeah. Maybe we should just highlight, because this can maybe seem a little like, what is the difference here? But just to explain also, the sequence version was maybe the should we say, idealist approach, because there we just said, well, of course, what you're moving from QA is identical to what you had in development, because you move that along and then you move it on to the next system. Maybe here we've also had a review of it and say, well, classic style had the whole idea of saying, no, I'm moving what I had in development. And then I test that and see that that transport was successful. Yes, so I move exactly the same thing to production. Because in the old version, you could say people could still change your QA environment and say, oh, I need to do a different configuration. I need to do this and that. And then you move that to production. But that would then maybe be a problem the next time you moved it from development. So you can say we're also more going back to a more locked version, a frozen version, where we say what you do in development, that is what you move all the way along. And if that's not working, you go back, change it in development, and move it along again. So it's just saying, like, there are pros and cons, and the first one is the sequence version is more generic and gives you more flexibility, but it's also, there's more things that can suddenly cause inconsistencies, and that you are certain about not happening in the locked version.
But so yeah, it both supported. It's the same way as working on no matter which of those you're using.
Yes. And I'm just going to touch on that. The locked version is also particularly relevant for the B2B setup. So that's why also I will show that. So I guess we are ready for the demo.
Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. I have my screen somewhere. You can now see.
Oh, it's a wrong direction. Yeah. No, better. Yes.
So you see FIGAF now, right?
Yep.
So I don't know how familiar you are with FIGAF, but here's the tool you start up in. What might first a little bit shock you is is all these menus out here, that there are a lot of different applications within FIGAF. And I'll be honest, it might take a little while to get used to it. You have to understand what the function of each of them are precisely, but they are, of course, all completely integrated. And you jump from one to the other quickly, and you then select the application that makes most sense for you for the overview that you might need. For me to begin, let me just start in DevOps, where we basically say, this is where either the business or the developer begins and say, well, we do need some kind of ticket system to manage this whole process of our change management. So you could say, like, in a very basic way, there is an option here to create a ticket. And then you select a given landscape. You see now here we have an awful lot. And before maybe I touch on that, I just want to quickly also go down in the configuration and say that this is where down first in the configuration, you start by defining your respective systems. It's then agents, we call it, but that can be both CPI tenants, it can be PI systems. You define these, and then you define your landscapes, which is basically your transport track. You can also say, just to translate it into sort of old terminology. But then you have these transport tracks, which then provides you with a lot of configuration options, of course. Just to say, one that I am going to use today to quickly show you is that you go in here and say, from here, I am moving from one agent, which is our demo dev system, to our demo test system. And then I have a second transport track, which is then again my demo dev to my demo production system. And this is what we mean about the locked version, where we're saying, like, basically every time we are always transporting from the same source system, but you then test your transport basically in the test system and saying, yes, I could successfully transport this and I can do all my testing, regression testing, and then now ready, can you approve whatever test we've done, and then go to the next composite landscape we have here, moving from demo dev to demo prod. And that leaves you with a bunch of configurations, as you can see here, where there's the option of saying, should I deploy immediately? Does this need approval? And just to say, like, for example, in production, you can see here we have enabled approval and say here, an admin can do it or I can do it. So that's very nice and convenient for me. And there's different B2B settings that I will also touch on that you can see. So that's just to show you that then once you actually go into the ticket system and say, I want to create a ticket, landscape, and this is, of course, we have a ton because we are testing all kinds of funny things. You would have ideally a lot shorter list, of course, of saying like we maybe only have one composite landscape that describes precisely how we want to move things from A to B. In a sandbox system, you might have a different, like we have, which is then a little more messy. I can just create a test for this webinar, and just to show you, and then this is where you can then completely freestyle it and add objects and what you want to then transport, and we can start the transport. Now, this was just to give you an idea of quickly the transport, where you create the ticket first and start the process, and from here you can then have ticket details and add external IDs, a JIRA number, and so on, and blah blah blah. Now, it was just to give you that little teaser, because what I think is more interesting is saying like, where does this first start? Like when we start a development, or we have a requirement, or something needs to be fixed or done, where do you start getting sort of the overview of like, what are we talking about? I mean, often I know a requirement, even in B2B, can be something like, we have this customer and they're complaining about something. We don't think quite it's working or something. And then you sit and go, okay, and then you start guessing. And that's always been something I hated doing, when I have to start guessing what it is that we're supposed to be doing. But unfortunately, in my experience as an integration developer, that can quickly happen. But here you have a much more better foundation of actually understanding what is going on. And one of those, you can say another application we have is our change tracking up here. And I want to especially focus on the landscape overview. So again, as you can see, you then have your composite landscape. So here again, we have our long list of landscapes that we can look at, but this is our locked development. So this is a landscape that is specifically then defined to use the new locked version transport mode. And this again, it's moving from 3 tenants or agents that we then call demo dev, demo test, demo prod. And then you can see here everything, comparing them like, okay, how does this look so far? And let's just give you an example. And I know there's only one package called V2, and that is our, it seems a little short. There. That is our standard SAP Cloud Integration Trading Partner Management package. So that's if you want to do B2B, and I'm just picking this as an example, but if you want to do B2B, this is standard content that you have to use. Or there's also the community version that you could also use, but we are going to focus on the SAP standard version 2. And what this is giving you, just as an example, is that now you can go in here and see, like for this standard package, let me just make it a little smaller so we can see everything here. You can then start to try and get an idea of, it's just not big enough. Can you see it now? There we go. That you have some options up here and saying like, what's the differences? Are there any differences? And now it will filter out and say, here you see differences. And we do see actually that our development, test, and production suddenly has different content. And we can see here the version number, and we can see that's, of course, aha, I see now that the development and test have actually been updated to 2.8.1, and production has not been updated. So suddenly here you have a place where you very quickly can get an overview of saying like, where are we? Are these systems even aligned anymore? Because that used to be sort of a manual task. And also when it comes to transport, do you want to transport standard content, or do you just update that locally? I've also seen kind of both processes where like, oh, we just update locally, right? And then it's important that everybody remembers when to do that and all that. Here you can quickly see that, is it done? Is it aligned? Yes or no? And you can see also here, you can say, are there even different deployment versions, deployments settings, statuses? And here you can see again that, for example, for one of these, the SFTP Center, which is a completely new iflow that was released with this new version, that is not deployed in test. And it doesn't even exist in production because the production is too old a version to even have it. So here again, you get this overview and can say, okay, there's something here I need to work on. This makes sense, or this needs to be managed. That are we actually updating our standard components correctly or content correctly? Similar, you can then say, I want to look at my B2B. And if we look at, for example, whoops, type.
I guess another thing you can see here is also, are there some things that you have configured differently but not deployed? Are there some parameters that are deployed with different parameters that you are using? So there's a lot of different specifications you can see in this list.
And then when we talk about B2B before, then let's talk B2B. Then first I would say it's also good down here to get familiar with the B2B component here, where you then have different menus and can go in and say, okay, here I can get an overview of the partners we have. We can see we have some communication partners and then also normal trading partners. We have our company, where we then also say, well, we might also want to have subsidiaries. This might be company code specific and say, okay, there for that and that for those, we need different agreements and so on. And then we have the scenarios, where we then say, okay, this is basically then what we're dealing with when we're talking about B2B. And again, if you look at the standard integration suite, then you say, well, fine, it's all there, and it is all there, but what happens, and it's okay when you have 10 agreements, but what happens when you have 1,000 agreements? How easy is it to get an understanding of what's happening? And that's also why we have this component here to give you a better overview of saying, like, we think here you have a better option of sorting and finding out precisely what is activated, precisely what is edited and needs an update. I would challenge anybody to go find that in the standard integration suite. That's a bit of a challenge, but here it's a quick sort, search, and find out, and you can manage that. Now, I'm going to take an example and say I have for Colgate, saying we're doing some business with Colgate. And we can see we're doing it for Luxembourg, is this, and we're doing it for Argentina, and we're doing it for the parent company in Denmark. If you don't believe me, I can just show you that we have some extra fields that you can easily add, and then you get, for example, let's see here, I get this, then you get also country code specific details, and you can see Colgate is all in Netherlands, and here we have for Luxembourg, Argentina, and Denmark. And we would even see if they were being managed by a communication partner.
And just to mention, we don't do business with with these. These are purely fictional names, but makes a
Fortunately, yes, they're just completely fictional. I'm starting to run out of companies I can just think of to add. So it depends on if I've just come after brushing my teeth, I guess. But let's see here. So we have it. So then, if you look at Colgate now, that we're doing business with, Aloha is doing business with. Then you have your agents up here, and there you can recognize maybe already the agents we talked about before. We have demo dev, we have demo test, we have demo pro. We've also a little copy tester here, and then we have a virtual system that might also be used. And when you then go through the system, then the agreement here, you can see a little important point I want to just highlight. And this is where we get into the technical details. I'm sorry, this is probably maybe going to be the most boring webinar you're going to look, because we are going through the really boring process of actually understanding what's going on here and what do we need to move. You see, the purpose of the system here is development system. And that's not something, of course, we came up with. That is, if you go, for example, to the Colgate, and you can jump into the CPI for any of these objects immediately and actually see what it looks like. So it's not something like only existing in our system. It's linked directly, of course, to the real objects in the integration suite. So if you jump in here, you will see that any given partner will have, or I assume should have, that's another little topic that you might want to think about, should have a complete system set up. So how are we going to manage, for example, a 3-layer landscape where we say, well, we have a development, we have a test, and we have a production setup for B2B? And what SAP has provided us of saying, like, well, you can create a partner, you can assign them systems, and those systems will have a purpose. Okay, so far so good. But that means I assume that when we then create an agreement, we say, okay, in development, I'm going to use the development system. And in test, I'm going to use the test system, and in production, I'm going to use the production system. Because in each of these, you then have to then define your communications. So for those of you who came from the PI world, this is of course a change of concept. In PI, we created a system, and then we created the communications or channels. And then we said, as we move along to the next environment, we then convert it into like rename the system, but basically we're using the same objects. We just rename it and say now it's a different technical system that you need to make the connection with. That's changed now. Now they're basically saying we create all of the systems, development, test, and production. You maintain all of them in your master system. So this is more like the SLD concept, where we say, okay, we then maintain everything in our master system, our development tenant, and then we transport it to test, we transport it to production. Also makes sense. Only problem is it's a little difficult to do in standard SAP, because what you want to do is, of course, to say, when we now have this here, this agreement that we can see we have where we are, our center system is a development. When we now go to test, it's of course important that then the purpose is a test system. And when we go to production, it's a production system. So, and that's not just, and here again, you can just go directly to the agreement, and from here link directly into the integration suite, and then confirm it and say yes. Of course, when this agreement was created, this B2B agreement was created in our development system, we assigned the development system. Now that we're moving it to test, then of course it has the test systems, and you can see that here specified as the test system.
So one thing, obviously, if you're not using B2B, this is not that relevant, but we will later also come back to the transport of content, normal integration suite content, and also short the overview. There is still a lot of content around that setup.
Yes, because also the B2B, even though it's B2B, it is also using normal design objects. So whether you have a normal A2A scenario, the same requirements for transport is also in the B2B often, because you will also have design objects in your B2B setup. And therefore it's important that those objects are moved along, and they are basically following the same rules as any normal A2A interface that you might have in your integration suite. So that's just why I'm using the B2B, because it's basically extra complexity, but all the same requirements that you have for A2A. So, but just showing here, we have also this translation of then objects that is required. So there might be multiple requirements on you to say we need to do some translation as we're moving things along. And some of these translations are simply not possible in the standard SAP world, but with FIGAF, you get these functionalities. So that's to show that we come from here. If again, I just show you, then we can see that for this Colgate, you might have noticed that suddenly, whoops, we suddenly only have 2 agreements. I went from development, I have 3, they're all active, and then we suddenly go to production, and then I can see I only have 2, and 1 is not active. So coming back to somebody's asking, saying like, I have a problem, and then you're going like, okay, I need to understand what the scenario is, and where do we begin? So going back here, again to the overview, you can then see your overview. And now in this case, I want to look at now agreements. And now I just happen to know that also our agreements, it has something to do with Colgate, according to our naming convention. And it's a whole other topic that I'd like to address some other time. But then if you look at this here now, then you again get the overview of what's going on. I'm sorry, I have to adjust because my screen is a little bit small, but now you can see here again, you get the overview and saying like, okay, we can understand that we have these 3 agreements with our partner Colgate. But what's the scenario? Well, they're all active in development, they're all active in test, but then in production, I suddenly see, well, somebody deleted it or something because it's gone here. So that we don't have. And also we see in production, we see it in draft mode. So that means it's not active. So this is a place where you could start and say, aha, I understand here, there's a problem and we need to fix this. Let's start first by saying, well, I don't like that we have something in draft here that was not activated. What's the option here? Again, if you're sitting with the responsibility, you could just kind of go, well, I guess we can press the button and activate and then hope everything is working. Or you can say, no, let's actually do this right. Let's then start by saying, okay, you could start here, but let's start instead from here, where we said, here you also have the overview, and said, well, one of the problems is that we saw that, again, I have to go look, we can see Argentina. So Colgate to Argentina is not activated. I can then go to my development system and say, Colgate Argentina, that's activated. Let's assign it to a ticket. So instead of going directly to the ticket and start finding and fishing objects, which is a little old school, instead we go here and say, no, we know now exactly what it is we want to test and what it is we want to move. So I go again and I pick now my locked development landscape. And now I said, well, this is Colgate to Argentina. This is orders. Oops, I got tabs. And then you create your ticket. Now again, through some of all these configurations I showed you before in the composite, for the A2A objects. So if you say, I want to move an iflow, you can move this iflow and say, okay, this iflow now needs to be moved. Then you have this button over here, which is very important, attach all dependent objects. And this is very relevant if you have an iflow that suddenly says, no, but this is using some functional libraries or other objects from other packages, from other, whatever, other subflows or whatever. Then all of these objects will then be added if you say, okay, I want all of it. On top of that, we also have a feature where we say for B2B, you can make this setting automatic. So it means that every time you pick a B2B scenario, it will automatically, it will just append all the dependent objects. So this is again a feature that you don't have to, like, you can still just pick single objects, but you can also just say, especially for B2B, you know what, let's just take everything every time so we're sure that nothing is missing. And here you can see this is just one B2B interface that has a mapping using different functional libraries. And look at it, the number over there on the right corner, 36 objects. That's 36 objects you need to be absolutely certain that this scenario will work. Now, probably 34 of them hasn't changed or will never change or whatever, but how do you know that? How do you know that those 36? And again, in the FIGAF transport tool, like, we're not just going to keep overwriting things or whatever, but in the tool, it will then do a validation check and say, hey, is your source system up to date? And if it's not up to date, or sorry, your target system, is your target system up to date? And if it's not up to date, then it will be added and imported. But this is just to make sure, hey, this is basically what you need to make sure is there. Otherwise, this is probably not going to work. So that's one thing that's good, where you can then say, okay, then you can say, should we start? Well, wait a second. Shouldn't we check if this is actually working? And this way you can then go to test cases. And then you can see you can look up for relevant test cases. So this will just take the one object that you have found now or assigned and said, like, are there any relevant test cases already created for this? And we can say, yes, there is here. And there we can see we have Colgate, and that's the scenario with the message type. And I just say, yes, that test case, of course, I want to assign this to my ticket. Now,
this can also be done if it's normal iflows and stuff like that. So there's
exactly. This is not B2B. Again, this is just an example, but if there's normal iflow, you just say, okay, there it is. So again, we just quickly jump back and say, well, now, because as you saw over here, we could actually already here see that here we have our test cases, and we can see, yes, for Argentina, we actually did have a test case. I can now also go to this agreement and just find an object, and this is just to show you and say that, okay, I can see that there's a lot of tickets here, and here's my ticket that I just created. So you have many ways to quickly find back and find your ticket. It's not like you have to go, of course, that's always an option, to just go look at tickets and say, wait a second, I think I can find mine in here in the list. But you can also be absolutely sure by saying, like, no, I know that what I'm working on is Argentina for Colgate. I'm going to look at that object, and I'm going to find the tickets, and I can see which tickets. I can see there's a bunch of canceled tickets, but there's one that's active, and that's probably the one I'm working on. And that's the one I'm working on.
And this is the part we talked about being able to trace back and forth in the system.
Yes, exactly. And keep having the overview of, like, what are we talking about? What are we moving? And do we have everything we need? And then, is it actually working? So that's why we have the test. And actually now we could already run the test right now. We could run it in development, and we could already run it in test. You could already say, let's test it in test, see how it acts before I move it, because we know it's already there. And then I can test it again after I moved it and say, let's then do it after I moved it. What I'm going to do now instead is I'm going to start the transport, because this takes a little time. That's the one thing that we have also as part of this process, is that we're doing a ton of validations. We're doing a ton of checks. So it also takes a little time, partially, and not to point fingers, but also because we are using standard SAP functionality for importing stuff like the B2B, and that sometimes also takes a little time. Now, look at the ticket here. You can see now we have an overview of our transports. There's also a transport overview here with links directly. And then you can see now we have one ticket created here, and now we have two transports. One that is moving from demo dev to test, and one that's moving demo dev to prod. Now, of course, you cannot move your demo dev to prod until you have completed your any preceding transports that might be there. Like maybe you only have two systems, development to prod, and then there would only be that one ticket, that one transport. But now we see, no, we have a test system that's part of our transport track that we defined in our composite landscape. So now it's like, no, you have to start now first with your move to test. Now, again here, you see all the nice objects that we say, okay, all of this needs to be moved. And as you might know, now we have an iflow, and this iflow, that's just like, yeah, that could just as well be an A2A iflow. It doesn't have to be B2B. But you can go in here and see actually transport configuration. And that's another, we think, very cool feature, because then down here, you also have many different settings, but one of them is also you can make sure to have a we call it sort of a replacement functionality, where it's said like, well, certain things might be set up where we say, for us, let me just say, this is a new one, so I'm going to save it here. Oh, did I pick the right one? Yes. Ah, sorry, I need to reload. And save.
So the part we wanted to achieve here was this, that we could go in our landscape configuration, and we did not need to remember which systems we were transporting. So whenever you did a change, it would actually fix the value from, or do a replacement instead of creating it from scratch. And this is the part we maybe something was missing in the landscape configuration.
Sorry, yes, let me just double check. So basically that configuration, oh, I don't want to delete it, is set up down here. Where's my, oh, sorry. Yes, I have it here. Replacement. Oh. Okay, we must have that. So part of I'm sorry, that must have been in a different system. But let's say, for example, that we say we have a substring where we know that when we are talking about demo dev, our translation needs to go and become a demo test as a parameter for a replacement.
And you can see here we have defined both from dev to test and from dev to production. It's two different validations that we do around this setup.
So yeah, now I also didn't get to set that. Probably, no, that's set up here. I don't know why that was deleted. So I go back to my ticket, and I go back to my transport. And that's why we can see now here that when we look at the iflow, it's a little, these are a little smaller, but what you can see now here is that we have the demo dev setting, and here you can see we have, for example, this is an archive folder that has been externalized, and then we say that in the archive folder we have this value, and you can see now that this is being translated as we move along. Now, this is again something where we can set up and say, no, you should not overwrite it. You should sort of respect the target, inherit from target. Or you can say, no, you inherit from the source, and then you do the translation according to the configuration you saw before. So this leads to this option of saying, like, all of this is something that you don't have to walk in and maintain all of these externalized configurations manually every time you deploy something and say, okay, what do I have to change this to, and what do I have to, you just set it up once in your transport track here, and then it does all of these translations for you, and you can deploy the thing immediately, and there's no need for any manual tasks of maintaining all of these things.
And this could be your host names, all of these, the standard setup that you are applying.
Yes. So, I mean, this, now we just picked a single, but this could be many, many properties that you put in there. And especially if you're using other adapters and stuff, you say, oh, there's a bunch of things we want to externalize, and all of that can be managed directly here from the tool, and not something that anybody has to sit and do manually. And again, that can be part of the approval process to also go in and check, hey, wait a second, are these things now being mapped or converted correctly? So again, something somebody can go in and check and verify before they then said, okay, let's move to the next phase. And the next phase here is that we are moving this now to test. Now this is where you see, and this also contains, you see there's a lot of stuff being checked here, because again, as we saw before, 36 objects. Gotta go in and see, and as you can see here, many of them might be actually marked here with skip, because target object is already with needed state already exists. So again, we're just doing the validation to make sure do you have everything you need. And once that is, we then start the standard SAP process of importing a TPM agreement, and we can see that's what's happening here. And then we do final validations just to check, is now everything correct and as expected.
Emil, we have like 7 minutes left.
Oh, yeah.
Just to keep us on track.
Yeah.
But as you can see, this is, so B2B, it's quite complicated, but we can see that it does also hold all the A2A integrations with the same capabilities, and that means you have one process for managing all of this integration. You can see the differences that has been applied on configurations of the objects, and here you have the design guidelines. You can see what has actually been imported here.
Yeah, and now just to say, like, now is the time when somebody then should have gone in and said, okay, we now need to execute these test cases. We now want to run them in our test system, because that's where it has been sent out. And then as you go in and see here last test, you can then go in here and see the status of your test case, poll for the messages, get the responses, and then you can go in and see a status of, was everything successful? It was successful, except there's still one message that I'm missing, and that's probably just because it wasn't still polling it. Oh, that was the last result. But then you can go in here and see, no, this is actually successful. Let me just get this and finished. And that means that now our test case is successful. And we then have a successful test in our ticket documented. And that means we can move to the next step, which is then, which is then going to the next transport, which is our production transport. And as you see here, there's no import button, because here we have the step send to approval. So there is also this step where then it is forwarded to the users that have the approval role. And we saw now here that that was assigned to the admin and to me. So that's why I now have the option of then approving or declining. And now I could do the analysis and say, okay, did they do the test? What has been included? Do all my checks. And once I've done all my checks and say, no, actually, this looks okay. I can see they tested it and it seems to have everything. I can now approve it. And once after this approval step, I now get the option to import and can then start the import to production and move it up there. What we don't get time to touch on, unfortunately, was as you saw, there was multiple problems. There was also an agreement that was completely missing. I was also going to add that. And when you add that, you then suddenly have two transports with the same objects. And what if I take my second transport and I change something, and then I move that, and then suddenly that moves to production before the first transport? And this is where you see, when you suddenly have so many overlapping objects, it's really important to say, well, either we do it in precisely the sequence that we create the transports, Or we somehow also say we can allow and have exceptions to say like, no, an older transport can still be imported, but then you have to then say, okay, what has then been preceding it and whatever. We have all of that also included in FIGAF. It's very cool, but it's just, I know it can sound and look complicated, but it really is important that we start focusing on saying like, how do you manage this? Because what do you do when you have 1,000, 5,000 iflows? How do you manage that? How do you make sure that suddenly, wait a second, are we doing this in sequence? What about dependent objects? Is anybody messing around with the dependent objects or not? All of that is something you get here where you get the overview, and the transport here will validate and say, hey, wait a second, there's a newer version of the object that you have in your transport. And that is now in production. So are you sure your test is still valid? All of that is going to be listed here, and then you can actually go in and say, no, wait a second, I need to test again because something has changed. So this is the transparency. Unfortunately, yeah, we don't have time to show it to you, but that is really the next
and obviously
phase.
there's a lot of also validations that Emil is not supposed to be or cannot approve his own transport, which I think makes sense. So you have this 4i principle whenever you move things into production. But yeah, it makes the demos a little faster if we can do that and not skip process. But I hope you also see this.
I think,
yeah.
No, go ahead.
I hope you see how much better this process would be. It's a complex one when you're doing TPM imports agreements, but the A2A is, well, it's a little simpler because you have fewer objects, but it still helps tremendously. So yes, see the demo. Spend an hour with, so we have created an Explorer edition of the FIGAF tool that that gives you a good understanding of what can be done. I'll just put it into the here. It's the URL for it. It allows you to actually explore what goes on. You can then do a plan a POC with your team, create a business case around the transport. But generally, I see that the transport obviously is a part of this, but this is the whole framework about how do you handle this? How do you govern transport, test? Everything is kind of included in this setup. And then once you have an idea for what you want to do, spend 4 hours, install it on your systems. There's a full trial that you can get. And then once you have seen, okay, this this actually saved our life. It saves a lot of effort. Buy the license, roll it out into the organization. It's fairly easy to get through this. Questions? Then put them into the chat. And yeah, if you want to schedule some more and learn more, then yeah, ping us and we can find out some more questions around this. Any questions on it? I hope that you found this this worth the time and can see how this how FIGAF Transport can simplify the way you're building and managing your integrations. Cool. So yes, thanks for your time. Yes. So yes, if we see a lot of customers using Cloud ALM, we do have APIs with this. So for instance, if you have Cloud ALM to manage your ABAP transport and other things, you can use the FIGAF tool, link it together with Cloud ALM, and then use that as a way to manage this. Because as you saw here, Cloud ALM will only do transport of the content, but does not understand all the dependencies, does not have externalized parameters. It's all manual effort. And that is what we try to convey here, that this automates all these setups. Does that respond or clarifies it? And we do have packages for Jira, ServiceNow, Azure DevOps, where you can use those as inputs to your landscapes.